Hello, thank you for coming back. I've recently gotten more time and an actual microphone. I'm excited to start adding regular content to this channel. I wanted to start off with following up on my first video and answer some of the questions in the comments, then going further into the depth of artificial scarcity. Granted, there weren't many questions, but luckily someone was kind enough to ask 3. Let's break this down, starting with the first questions. How do you explain the scarcity of bread in socialism, as in bread lines? Well, first off, capitalism has had food lines in the past, seen here, and currently does now. How does a capitalist explain food lines in its system? Now, typically you'll get the answer individual choice. A capitalist will tell you there are no market failures, just individual failures, and that the system is perfect and rational, just the people in the system aren't. Another dodge is to liken the markets themselves as some unexplainable force of nature we are simply subjected to. A good example of this is Wyatt Coke. Now, Wyatt Coke, who will inherit billions tax-free, is simply rewarded by the market's perfect rationality, while the grandma, who lost her home to the current Secretary of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, over 27 cents, is being punished by the market justly because the market is always rational. This type of thinking isn't economics, it's theology. Now, regardless of all that, let's move to the point of the original question. There's many reasons why a socialist country might employ the use of food lines. As I said before, capitalist countries use this method of food distribution as well. For an exact answer, I need to know what country and what time period. If we're talking about the Soviet Union between the period of 1917 through 1947, during 1917 through 1920, the Soviet Union had just finished a brutal revolution overthrowing their monarchy, which was precluded by a disastrous campaign fighting the Germans back in World War I. They then went through a period of rapid industrialization, during which took place throughout World War II. After 1947, they didn't face any more famines. They had relatively the same food insecurity the U.S. had during the 1950s through 1990s, which was handled by programs similar to food stamps. China itself went through similar factors: a multi-faction civil war, interrupted by World War II, followed by a revolution and a rapid period of industrialization. Now, smaller, more undeveloped nations such as Cuba or the DPRK, better known as North Korea, have food insecurities and use food rationing. Now, however, this is due to heavy sanctions preventing trade and lack of land to expand food production. Meanwhile, the food insecurity we face is due to artificial scarcity, while Cuba and North Korea have food insecurity because of lack of arable land and sanctions cutting them off from trade. Their issue is an issue of poor diplomacy and lack of resources. Ours is an issue of adhering to the logic of the market. Let's backtrack a bit, because when it comes to the issue of famines in socialism, there were famines before socialism even existed. The constant food insecurity is one of the reasons for revolt in China and Russia. The reasons for famines was because of real scarcity. This scarcity was overcome by industrialization. Famines were happening in these regions and stopped after the implementation of the 5-year plan and Great Leap Forward, which were economic policies around the industrialization of the economy in a rapid amount of time. Many nations had already gone through this process of industrialization already. The Soviet Union and the PRC were simply catching up, after which no famines had occurred. Now, I don't think it was any economic system that ended the cycle of famines, but rather technology, and that technology was adapted by each for their own logic. Socialism and capitalism are responses and products of the era of industrialization and the problems that came with it. If you want a more in-depth look into the history and economics of the Soviet Union or the PRC, I suggest watching the Finnish Bolshevik or Democratic Socialist 1. I'll be linking 2 relevant videos in the description along with all my sources. Okay, now on to the second question. Or scarcity of almost any commodity for that matter. Okay, so this question threw me for a loop for a second. I didn't know if this was trolling or a bad faith argument or just a genuine question. So I'm going to treat it like a genuine question. So just because artificial scarcity exists, that doesn't mean that scarcity can't also exist. If a commodity is scarce not because of artificial scarcity, but because of lack of productive forces, technology to create those productive forces, or a simple lack of resources. Then the good is scarce for those reasons. The only way to get around that is either by finding alternative sources of the resource, or investing in technology to increase the productive forces, depending on why that good is scarce. Now, there are simply some things that will always be scarce. There's no factory that can produce handwritten first editions of Moby Dick at a post-scarcity level. But achieving post-scarcity for most things is possible, and in many ways we already have. And the reason I made my first video was to raise attention to scarcity caused by market forces, which can be changed through policies. Okay. Alright, last question. How about the scarcity to speak freely or move freely? Any theories on those scarcities? So those things aren't physically scarce. They're scarce because they have been commodified or they're restricted via law, or both. Now this goes back way further than capitalism or industrialization. They play a part into our modern day predicaments concerning those issues, but restriction of speech and movement likely go back to the Neolithic era. As one economist once said, the history of man is the history of class struggle. Power is in land and speech, and there have been exploitative systems that control the access to them since the first human tribe came to power through farming. I want to go deeper into depth about why artificial scarcity happens. Now, the crisis of artificial scarcity is due to artificial scarcity itself being the solution to the crisis of overproduction. As I mentioned in my previous video about the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, which paid farmers to destroy surplus food in order to stabilize prices, they had to do this because industrialization of farming, which was pushed heavily by many nations during World War I, caused the market to face deflation. After supply wasn't needed as much, farmers were receiving less subsidies and government contracts. The new technology they acquired during World War I increased yield while reducing labor costs. This saturated the market with cheap food, reducing the income of the farmers and preventing them from paying on property taxes, any bank loans that they may have taken out. And the video I showed earlier was of Italian dairy farmers who were dumping milk in protest of low prices. Similar acts of protest were done by U.S. farmers during the Great Depression. Capitalists will say the drop in prices isn't due to overproduction, but because of fall of demand, which is a semantic argument because a fall in demand can be the reason and or factor for a crisis of overproduction itself. Such was the case for farmers in the U.S. during the 1930s. Demand fell after World War I and prices sank. The problem is this creates unemployment as well as disrupts the food supply when the inevitable market correction happens. Marxist theory explains this best. As I've said, all my sources are linked in the description. This section can be found under Marxist theory of crises. For Marx, capitalist crises are crises of overproduction. Too many commodities are produced than can be profitably sold, and too much capital has been invested in industry. In the attempt to claim a share of the available profits, this comes about because capitalism, on both the domestic and international scale, is a system of separate and independent ownerships. In prosperous times, every capitalist invests as much as he can and steps up production. In particular, the periodic booms stimulate the production of fixed capital. The buildings and machinery which are not used up in one cycle of production and therefore do not have to be immediately replaced. When times are good, all resources are strained to bring new fixed capital into production. But once this capital starts producing, a flood of commodities is brought into the market, and the crisis ensures. Unemployment, which falls during the boom, rises again. The high rate of profit that stimulated the boom declines. First, when the low level of unemployment strengthens the bargaining power of the workers, and further when the crisis forces production to slacken off. The crisis eventually takes its toll. Masses of workers are thrown out of their jobs. As a result, wages are forced back down towards subsistence or below, and the weakest, smallest, and least modern plants go under. But the effects of the slump enable profitability to revive. Labor can be hired at low wages. Factories, equipment, and materials can be bought by the surviving capitalists at bargain prices. So the slump is followed by a new recovery period and in turn by a new boom. Thus, the boom period of the cycle carries out what Marx called the concentration of capital, its expansion and technological advance, just as the slump period already described tends to carry out the centralization of capital, its unification into fewer hands through takeovers and mergers. Overproduction, as the analysis of crisis, is frequently transformed by reformist theories into underconsumption. The idea that the masses of workers are paid too little to buy back what they produce. This leads to the program of persuading wise managers and concerned capitalists to advance their own self-interest by paying workers more. The workers will then be able to consume and purchase more, and thereby crises will be forestalled or dampened. There are insolvable problems with such theory. First of all, as Marx pointed out, crises arise in the wake of cyclical high wages for labor, not low. As well, much of what is produced and overproduced under capitalism is a means of production, not simply commodities meant for working class consumption. Even the best paid workers do not buy manufacturing equipment. Thirdly, the masses' underconsumption and the sense of their inability to afford the full range of commodities needed for a comfortable standard of living is a constant of life under capitalism through both boom and bust. If underconsumption were the cause of crisis, then the crisis would not be cyclical but permanent. To just summarize what was said by Marx was that during boom cycles, capitalists will invest heavily into production. This production leads to an oversaturation of the market. This leads to a bust cycle. During this bust cycle, capitalists will then respond by buying up cheap labor, assets, and capital, thus centralizing more of the economy under their control. Reformers of capitalism respond to this in various ways. Teddy Roosevelt implemented a policy of trust busting, trusts which are just basically monopolies, and implementing a series of reform regulations called the Square Deal. FDR responded by breaking up monopolies and implementing a package of reforms and regulations called the New Deal, and as we could see with the rise of Bernie Sanders and AOC, due to an economy that's highly monopolized, again, and 40 years of stagflation, we may see history repeats itself in the form of the Green New Deal. Reforms help and can offset the negative effects of overproduction, but they usually just get repealed down the line and companies monopolize. Yesterday it was Standard Oil, today it's Exxon. Now, to close out Marx's thoughts. Overproduction demonstrates the necessary contradictions of a system that has the potential to produce real abundance, yet under which that very potential causes a breakdown every time it builds up. In the classical epic of capitalism, the cycle reflected the system's initial progressive role. The class struggle compelled the capitalists to advance productivity, accumulate more and more means of production, and therefore to produce useful commodities more cheaply. For the first time in history, scarcity, with all its epidemic misery, starvation, wars, and pestilence, was no longer an inescapable part of human life. Technology and industrialization have for the most part bettered our lives. A good chunk of humanity doesn't face the horrific conditions of pre-industrial life. Sadly, though, we could use our abundance of resources for the development of humanity, but most of our resources are wasted in the never-ending cycle of boom and bust and the never-ending greed of the market, which doesn't even contribute to human happiness or even survival. It doesn't even really produce worthwhile consumer goods anymore. Most are marginal improvements of the last model and subjected to planned obsolescency. Others are trinkets and passing fads like fidget spinners and other doodads. The wide selection of essential oils at the store aren't curing diseases that still inflict us, but some higher personality or snake oil salesman can legally tell you that they do. How do we fix this system? As Marx laid out earlier, it seems we're trapped in a cyclical cycle and have been for a while. One where capitalism eats itself and reform sweeps through and resets the monopoly board. These reforms are slowly removed until the machine overheats again and reform is once again necessary. How can we break this cycle? Well, I'm not entirely sure. I do know that it will require serious building of new institutions whose structure revolve around serving the interest of society, ones that don't use our coercive hierarchy or easily manipulated currency system. I'm not the first one to suggest this or even the first to try. Tackling these problems we face as a society is going to be a long-term project. Thank you for watching. My next video, I'm planning on either diving into American history or maybe tackling a response video. When I first started this, I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go, and I'm still kind of trying to figure it out. So if you guys have any topics that you might want me to look into or talk about, feel free to comment, and, have a great day.